Hi, this is Paul. One of the best pieces about this whole Jordan Peterson journey I've been on has been all of the resources that a number of you have sent me. Now, one individual almost from the beginning keeps bringing Owen Barfield into the conversation, and this actually is a book that he sent me. Owen Barfield was a good friend of C.S. Lewis. He was a theosophist, unlike Lewis, and Lewis didn't have a lot of respect for his theosophy. But Lewis and Owen Barfield were deep friends, and Lewis considered Owen Barfield one of his great intellectual rivals. Barfield didn't have anywhere near the kind of academic or career success that Lewis had, but Barfield was a brilliant man with incredible insights that are really very pertinent to the Jordan Peterson, Vervaeke, Jonathan Peugeot questions of meaning and the meaning crisis. And so what this individual wrote me today, we'll just call him John, what John wrote me, actually he wrote it earlier in the month. I always save his emails until I know I'll have time to pause and read through them and really consider them, because he usually attaches some really terrific insights into his post. And what I read today was so important and so timely, even though a lot of the thinking I did after he had actually written this, I thought I'd share the whole letter with you. And I'll leave his name out of it, but I wanted to share his thoughts, and his name isn't anywhere in here. I know I've written about Barfield's concept of evolution of consciousness, but I thought I'd take another stab in light of Vervaeke's Meaning Crisis series and your interest in it. It seems that most who reflect on our sense of perceptions believe that only a tiny sliver of the universe's stuff, Barfield's unrepresented, is focused on and organized by the human consciousness. Now, actually, yesterday I played a little bit of, I'm not sure if it made it into my video that I released this morning or not, but Jordan Peterson postulates that part of what Piaget thought, was it Piaget or someone else, thought of one of the real functions of our brain is to take all of this data and greatly limit it down to it. And Peterson said, what our brains can really fit in is like 4 bytes a second, and I have no idea how that's figured into it. But basically our brains limit and shrink down and condense and compress all of this information into consciousness, into this place of consciousness that we have to try to get a handle on. And this is where the different parts of our brain, if a ball or a rock came shooting here, I would duck. My brain is watching it in a way that it's not going to talk to my conscious self, because my conscious self is way too slow. So if there's a snake in the grass, I'll jump back, and I'll be, well, why did I jump back? Well, obviously my conscious self is not really in control of my body. And so this gets into Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris's big conversation about, are we really just these creatures in space that walk through and see objects, or is there a whole lot more going on? And so Barfield was of the belief that there's a whole lot more going on, and in fact, a lot of what we are is built into us by our cultures and our contexts. I'll start that paragraph again. It seems that most who reflect on our sense perceptions believe that only a tiny sliver of the universe's stuff, Barfield's unrepresented, is focused on and organized by the human consciousness, and that this particular sliver, Barfield's collective representations, is perceived because it is useful or adaptive. And again, that would be very much in line with Peterson's ideas about, we see opportunities and threats. That's what we perceive. That's what our brain is designed to really capture. Our current collective representations may be adaptive in a technological sense. It seems that though they are not adaptive in a meaning sense. And this is when we see, so there's a bias that has developed in us over the last couple of 100 years, this technology bias. Now, we've always had this bias towards opportunity and threat, but now this has taken on a certain technological aspect. And you'll often hear me remark in my videos when I notice how often our evaluations of things are about their utility. Now again, part of this is built into us, but they're often about our technological utility. And a good someone, let's say an observer from another age or another world, might come in and look at the way we practice economics. How, for a long time I've thought that a much more sustainable practice in economics and in industry, let's say, would be to always build into the cost of purchasing a product the cost of disposing or managing the back end of that product. This gets into cap and trade questions about CO2. We practice this when you buy a computer in California. You have to spend a little bit of money for the computer recycling business. When you buy tires in California, you have to spend a little bit of money for the tire recycling. When you buy a car battery in California, you have to spend a little bit of money for the back end of the car battery. And often, if you buy a car battery, if you return your old battery to the place, they'll give you money for the core. In other words, in these selective practices, you build into the consumer's cost of a product in a sense, the life cycle or an approximation of the life cycle of that product. But we have this technological bent that is built into our culture. That's our software side. So our current collective representations may be adaptive in a technological sense. It seems as though they are not adaptive in a meaning sense. And so, in other words, it's clear that the meaning crisis is a function of our culture, and we're trying to come to grips with it. And in fact, John Vervaeke's whole series is about, how can we reappropriate, at least so far, we're just a few episodes into it, how can we reappropriate axial age psychotechnologies to add meaning to the new constant cosmos, which is devoid of meaning, and the axial age meaning tools set aside. With this in mind, are our collective representations, again, we don't choose these we simply inherit, our collective representations in the process of evolving to become more adaptive in that sense? In other words, are we continuing to move away from meaning as we're continuing to see the world through these lenses that we've created? Or are we perhaps discovering that we've gone too far out and it's killing us, literally, in terms of rates of suicide? You might ask, well, who is us? Well, who is dying in suicide rates? So meaning is that we're being separated from it. Maybe we're going to come back. Well, we'll see. We see the world in the same way as our fellows, cultural and temporal. Our collective representations have come about through an ineffable process. We agree on what we see and perceive in our other senses, but no one can describe the process by which we reach that agreement. In other words, we don't know how we do it. In fact, we're not even conscious of it. But these collective representations that we simply assume that are simply passed on to us by others, well, they're there. A child cannot be taught to ride a bike, which he has not seen anyone ride, by giving him a detailed description of which parts of his body must move in what sequence. He is a bicycle apprentice who must have a master to emulate. How to ride the bicycle is something he picks up from his master, a parent or a bicycle riding friend. By analogy, we are all this child as we pick up the ineffable clues as to how our fellows perceive the world. And this picking up starts very early in our lives, probably in the womb. Many who have talked to me and written to me have told me how they either had, especially those who were raised without a religion, that it's very difficult for them to believe in, now I'm going to put it in these terms, in God number one. Because it's very difficult to believe in God number two without God number one being there at the base of it. And so, they're trying, they're working, they want to, but it doesn't come easily. Well, and part of the argument here made by John, who wrote this letter, is that, well, this isn't something that you just intend to do. It's probably in some ways not unlike learning another language or riding a bicycle. But if you've ever tried to learn another language as an adult, you realize it is a monumental effort. And most of the time, what's really involved in learning another language is immersion in the community of the language. I had Spanish classes in high school and college, but when I got to the Dominican Republic, I was pretty useless. Well, after a while of butchering the Spanish language in the Dominican Republic, I could do some things. And that informs us as to something about us and the mimetic nature of us. And what is required of us to begin to take on another worldview. And in fact, one of the things that you realize when you do go to another country and learn another language is that you in some ways split yourself, because there's this English side of you and there's this Spanish side of you. And often talk to missionaries who had to do this quite intentionally. Immigrants have a less intentional process often, but in a sense you split a side of you. There's the English language side of you and there's the Spanish side of you, and sometimes the two sides of you have different personalities. And that very much goes into these collective representations that sounds fairly abstract, but you get a sense of it from the words. These collective representations that we live within and trade with and become the commonalities by which we live and move and have our being. Vervaeke's analysis of the meaning crisis, I think, omits a crucial element. Our collective representations today are not the collective representations of tribal, ancient, or medieval men. They thought about their collective representations. We think about ours. How successful can we think about theirs? So this is a big divide. And John here, who writes this letter to me, I think has a real point. There's a big divide. When you read ancient literature, you get a sense of the distance. And I deal with this as a pastor because I study the Bible, and I try as best I can to get into the original language, get into the ancient history, get into the commentaries, but you're always as an outsider. In fact, as a foreign missionary working with Haitians who were living in the Dominican Republic, I was always an outsider. I would never know what the Haitians knew. I would never be up to speed on their worlds or see the world as they did. My thinking was just radically changed by my culture. And in many ways, the Haitians that I lived and worked with, they lived in a radically different world than I did. And you'd bump up into those differences all the time. Our embodied brains may be structurally identical to those of past ages, but men of pre-modern times did not perceive the world as we do. That seems pretty obvious. Does not this interfere with our ability to understand what was meaningful to them and to appropriate their insights? That's a good point. An example from Barfield of the way our collective representations and meaning interact. There were plenty of skilled artists in the Middle Ages, and they would have certainly hit upon it, meaning perspective, soon enough, if depth in space had characterized the collective representations they wished to reproduce, as it characterizes ours. They did not need it. They couldn't have done perspective. Why didn't they do perspective? Before the scientific revolution, the world was more like a garment men wore about them than a stage on which they moved. The stage on which we moved is sort of is it a form for action? Is it a space for objects? The world is a garment that they wore. And in fact, if you read the Apostle Paul, Paul keeps writing about taking off the old self, putting on the new self, be clothed by the Spirit of God. And we can understand this metaphor, but it's likely that our collective representations don't fully, because our collective representations are different, we don't access this metaphor probably in the way that Paul did. Men of the Middle Ages didn't need perspective. Later, when the world came to be more and more objectified as meaning was drained out of it, this world of objects was ready for men to take a new place in it and to reflect on their perspectival position among the objects. Do those searching for meaning today ever give a thought to the ramifications of men in other times, cultures, perceiving a different world than we do? Again, you bump up to this more often when you live cross-culturally, especially when you go intentionally, let's say, to a people, as missionaries often do, to a people in another part of the world who, this is difficult because if you're living this American middle-class life, there are people living similar lives all around the world. But as many missionaries do, if you go and you work, let's say, with very poor people, people of a different culture, you begin to feel the distance. And in the Dominican Republic, I had quite a bit of commonality with Dominicans who, let's say, studied in the United States and got an advanced degree in the United States and had a visa to the United States, and maybe who lived in the United States for a number of years and then went back to the Dominican Republic. I had way more in common with them than I had with the Christian Haitian pastors that I was working with. They lived in a vastly different culture than I lived in. And I told the story before about my friend Fanel, who believed in the flat earth, and asking me if I was going to drive my car back to New York. And I was just thinking, you live on an island, but what did the world look like through his eyes? Was the discovery of perspective a leap forward for Western art or a step towards our current meaning crisis? Is it possible that our thrashing about for meaning is like the thrashing of a fish out of water, in the end a futile activity? We cannot perceive with the consciousness of, say, a first-century men. We don't swim in their sea. We can only read their writings and view their art with our eyes, with our vastly different collective representations. Don't these differences in collective representations need to be taken into account and thought about? As much as N.T. Wright's scholarship purports to show us Jesus in his proper historical setting, we cannot become witnesses to that history in the same way that we can witness World War II through a historical account. And even so, if you listen to testimonies during World War II, you can see the difference in world. David Brooks writes about those differences well in his book, The Road to Character. He has Adam 1 and Adam 2 in his book. The collective representations of the 1940s were not so drastically different from ours, yet they were different, and we can sense those differences. Once meaning had started to be abstracted from the world in the axial age, men sought to find a way to reunite it. Vervaeke and Peterson believe that by analyzing the way, they surmise, men experienced meaning in the past, we are able, with the aid of cognitive science and ruminating on past philosophical and theological systems, to reintroduce the experience of meaning into our abstracted world. To manufacture meaning as a consumable for our limbic systems. This is a terrifically important question with respect to Vervaeke and Peterson's projects. Our collective representations disclose a world of objects that we try, mainly in vain, to inject meaning into. We perceive, touch, and inhabit a world of objects. Can we just introduce a meaning patch, or be reminded that story rules all, or does our collective consciousness need to evolve? Is it evolving? And these are interesting questions. One of the things that I noted in, let's say, the divide in Christianity between Pentecostals and non-Pentecostal or charismatic individuals, I've always thought that difference wasn't really theological, there were usually some theological differences, but the shift was actually cultural, and that And that Pentecostalism, in a sense, shifts the culture, shifts these collective representations, where you've got an author like Frank Peretti, who wrote a very popular book in the 80s and 90s, This Present Darkness, which was a novel in which you had all the humans running around, and then you had all the angels and demons running around. C.S. Lewis does a similar thing, quite a different book in the Screwtape Letters, but Frank Peretti's novel, This Present Darkness, a tremendously successful novel, and many Christians lived in that re-enchanted world. Now, what I always found interesting in terms of studying the New Testament and looking at that world, it was, of course, a specific re-enchantment from a 20th century perspective. It was in some ways, pardon my analogy here, Mormon individuals, it was in some ways the sense I get from reading the Book of Mormon, where someone is trying to talk like the King James Bible. And so in that way, I've never found certain Pentecostal appropriations of attempts at appropriating the first century cultural world convincing, because they always had to pass through 20th century filters. And some of today's interest in psychedelics an attempt to recreate the original participation with the world that tribal people had, to perceive the world with unscienced eyes. Now what's interesting about that is, if you read Michael Pollan's book, one of the very interesting things about psychedelics is that they're so context specific, and that the trip you have will be incredibly dependent on the context that you're living in, incredibly dependent on your own story, your own history, all of this. And so in that sense, even though you would imagine, oh, by appropriating the shamanistic technology of a psychedelic, that's a very to rewind the tape in my brain and take me back to a primitive person. That's a very technical, that idea bears very technical assumptions about how people work, and collective representations about technology and process and all of this. And you can see that, again, you can't step into the same river twice. See why I like this letter? This is really profound stuff, and he asks terrific questions. I'll start that paragraph again. In some of today's interest in psychedelics, an attempt to recreate the original participation in the world that tribal people had, to perceive the world with unscienced eyes, the kind that used to see meaning in the other side of objects. I remember listening to a story of, I don't know, was it Peterson or Vervaeke or some other video? They all start to, merge together in my consciousness congress, where some person was dealing with a group of tribesmen from a jungle context who were mostly living from a perspective. And when I pause often, it's because the consciousness congresses, people are raising their hands saying, I got something for your video. It's like, hold on, everybody. The mouth can only take so much flow. We'll see if they remember it in 5 minutes. See, now I forgot what I was even saying. Yeah, so there was this modern person is standing on a beach with this, what we would call in pejorative sense, a primitive person, and the other person was seeing ancestors, spirits. That was all around them. The modern person couldn't see anything. What's going on there? Well, they've got these collective representations. They're really in many ways living in different worlds. Now, at this point then, when you begin to see this, you begin to ask yourself, well, what are the commonalities? And you can see, in a sense, the point of a physicalism. Vervaeke used that in his question and answer, and I really like the term because it connects it to physics rather than matter, and really physics is more of what we're looking at. So you look at a physicalism, and so well, now I'm going to have to bring it in. Let's see, I'll pause. Another terrific tidbit that someone sent to me is this YouTube, the fantastic invasion of John Frum and the USA, where this tribe basically told their own story about, and it started before they had contact with the white man. Everything was perfect and idyllic, and everything that they had was provided there for them, and things were wonderful. And so then along comes these guys in a ship, and what's great is that the people are acting this out, and they're going through the steps, and they're telling their own story of everything that happened, and it's from their eyes. I'm not going to play this because I think it was a BBC thing, and I don't know if it'll get pulled down or not. I don't want to deal with the hassle of strikes and having things pulled down. But they tell their story from their own perspective. And again, this gets into the collective representations. And in a sense, they can't go back again, because once they see the cargo, and this word comes up in Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Once they see the cargo, well, it's all different. So it's a cargo cult. Let's go back. Barfield said that a return to this original participation, but again, there in a sense there's only original participation sounds pretty static. The time at which the document was written, the time at which the whatever past day is being pointed to, it's all within a stream. It's all within a process. Barfield said that a return to this original participation was not an option. Our consciousnesses have journeyed too far from it, and our world has been drastically changed by technique. Can travel between two such divergent worlds be more than a distraction of tourism or the consumption therapeutic meaning? The Jordan Peterson phenomenon and related forays into thinking about meaning could be a glimpse into our future consciousness, without which meaning, in more than its therapeutic guise, will continue to be an elusive prize. Can meaning be shoehorned into our world, or do we first have to perceive the world anew, chicken or egg? Are we sensing a shift in the consciousness of the West that will facilitate what Barfield calls final participation, or will our nearly total preoccupation with technique derail this development? Now, part of what, again, I only can post about half of the conversations I have with many of you, and some of your conversion stories are dramatic, and some of the turnings that you've had, some of you might still be trying to believe in God and not all that successfully, but you found meaning. And part of this Salience project is you're watching my videos, and you're watching Peterson and Vervaeke and a whole bunch of other things that you're finding, and you are in fact finding meaning. So I don't know that it's necessarily so lost, but I think all of these. I want to do a little bit of covering there. Sorry for the sloppy edit. And yes, if you haven't guessed it, I'm one of those whose whole life has been marked by the anxious depression of our transitional age, one of those canaries in the coal mine who through the grace of suffering has been allowed the privilege of a pilgrimage. But to where? Thanks again for your videos and introducing me to the Distributist. I just watched your Ken Wilber video. Regarding the layers of Scripture, perhaps it would be helpful if scriptural analysis in the future took into account that those who wrote the Bible did not perceive the world with a 21st century consciousness. They perceived from a different sliver of stuff that we do. They saw things differently. They did. Part of the challenge, though, is to figure out how and in what way. It's daunting to be divided like that and to recognize the distance. They figuratively, their figurations were different. Their collective representations were different. How do we know what they saw? A start might be to read what they wrote about what they saw, to believe them, and through acts of imagination to try to empathize with what they saw. But we cannot perceive what they perceived. Just watch Peugeot's Flat Earth video. And again, Barfield is helpful. Try as they may, people of today are not able to perceive a flat earth under a dome of heavens because of our collective representations. Flat earthers can imagine the figurations of earlier people, but they cannot perceive a flat earth for themselves. If they do so, they are play acting or mad. That's the end of his note. He usually has an email and then a really nice note attached to it, which is obviously something that he's worked on and gone over. And this one, many of them have been really excellent, but this one was so germane and so helpful to the entire conversation. What to do with it? I think in a sense we have to give the distance that we have from those in our past its due. And again, for me as a Christian, you know, we are, as a Protestant Christian, we are saved by grace through faith. And part of what that means is we don't get everything right. I will never see the world as the Apostle Paul did. I will not even see the world as the Haitians do. And you'd have to figure that a God who could create a world like this is capable of managing all of these differences and judging us given all of our different contexts, so on and so forth. But I thought, again, this note that he sent me was of such quality and such an important point in the whole conversation that I could have put it out on a blog post, but you wouldn't have seen it. And so I thought, well, this deserves its own video. So there it is. So thank you, John, for your continued presence in this conversation for me. And I asked him if he'd be willing to share it, and I shared it anyway, but I made sure that his name isn't in it. But it just really helpful. I'll probably wait till I hear back from him before I release this video. So anyway, thanks a lot.